Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's 11:15 here in DC, so we are going to go ahead and get started with the third session of our conference. And I'm going to move the mic closer, so hopefully everybody can hear me better. The third session of the RISE conference, which is the session focused on politics. And I should say straight away that I'm not the expert on politics from our team. I'm really excited to be chairing this session and to bring together three really exciting papers, two of them that focus on countries that are part of the RISE program, and one that brings a perspective from a country that we don't hear about as often in RISE. So two of the papers are what I think of as big systems, big political economy analysis papers, and they're trying to understand the political economy of education at a national level, one using a political settlements framework, and the other trying to apply some of the principles of systems thinking that we've been using throughout the RISE program. And that first paper is to apply political settlements to understand the education system in Indonesia and the historical evolution of the political economy of education in Indonesia, and the systems thinking lens applied to a study in Vietnam. And then a third paper that provides a much more recent case study of a decentralization experience in Nepal, and looking specifically at trust and accountability in the recent decentralization in the education system there. So I'm really excited to welcome our three panelists. We'll start off with a presentation by Andrew Rosser, who's from the University of Melbourne and the RISE team on Indonesia. And then we'll move to a presentation from Jonathan London from Leiden University and also a member of the RISE Vietnam team looking at Vietnam. And finally, we'll come, she's here in DC, although not here in this room, to Shwetlana Sabharwal, who is at the World Bank and is a member of the RISE Tanzania team, but we'll be presenting her work on Nepal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to start us off.
Thanks, Marla. I'm just waiting for my slides to appear on the screen, so give me a moment. Yep, all right, I think I'm underway. Look, before I get into the presentation of the paper proper, I should just make a couple of preliminary comments. I mean, the first is to acknowledge my co-authors. This paper's been co-written with Phil King and Danang Widioko. The second thing is that whilst we started out with the intention of writing a paper of around about 10 to 15,000 words long, it ended up being around about 30,000 words long. The paper, which is available, runs to something around 100 pages, and it's an enormous challenge to try and provide a summary of that in 15 minutes. But I will do my level best to capture the main ideas, and I guess that's what the presentation will really focus on: the main ideas, the main messages. But there's a lot of detail, historical detail, and detail around a particular set of case studies in the paper as well. We start the paper by just noting that Indonesia is in the midst of a learning crisis. Over the past few decades, Indonesia has made great strides in improving access to education. Indonesian children are starting school earlier and staying in school longer than they ever have before. But the country has made relatively little progress in improving educational quality and learning outcomes. And there's quite a bit of evidence of that now, whether it comes from the country's performance in international standardized tests or the sort of evidence that my colleagues in the Indonesia country team have managed to marshal with regards to educational performance using Indonesian data sources. That evidence is also kind of manifest in a statement made by Indonesia's former Minister of Education, Anies Baswedan, at the end of 2014, when he declared that the country was facing an education emergency. Conventional analyses, and by that I mean in particular analyses of Indonesia's education system, published by donor organisations and a lot of education policy scholars have attributed the poor quality of Indonesia's education system and its difficulties in improving learning outcomes to its proximate causes, in particular inadequate funding, human resource deficits, perverse incentive structures and poor management. They've accordingly recommended that the Indonesian government increase education funding, improve teacher training and reform education administration. By contrast, drawing on a political economy style of analysis, we argue in our paper that the country's problems with education quality and learning have been at their root a matter of politics and power. Specifically, they've stemmed from the continued political dominance of predatory political, bureaucratic and corporate elites for much of the period since that country declared independence in 1945, and in particular throughout the New Order and post-New Order periods. The New Order period was a period of authoritarian rule. President Suharto was the dominant political figure. It was a military-backed regime. The post-New Order period, by contrast, has been characterised by democratisation, although more recently a process of democratic regression, but nevertheless a shift away from authoritarian rule to a more democratic political system. Also a significant process of decentralisation from the central level down to the district level. Indonesia administratively has three main levels of administration: the central government level, the provincial level, and the district level. And decentralisation in Indonesia entailed a devolution of authority down to the district level, including in relation to education, although not higher education. That remained centralised. So in broad terms, then, we argue that Indonesia has not just lacked the financial, human resource and administrative prerequisites for a high quality education system, but crucially the underlying political prerequisites. Now, as Marla noted in her introductory spiel, we employ in this paper a political settlements framework. I don't have time here to go into great detail about that framework, but I've noted Mushtaq Khan's definition of a political settlement on this slide. Mushtaq Khan's a key figure in the literature on political settlements and development. He's defined them as combinations of power and institutions that are mutually compatible and also sustainable in terms of economic and political viability. And applying in applying the political settlements framework, we focus on two main tasks. The first is identifying the actors who are involved in contesting education policy and its implementation in specific contexts, their interests and agendas. And the second is understanding, I've just skipped ahead a slide, understanding the evolution of education policy and its implementation in terms of continuities and shifts in the balance of power between these actors and associated processes of contestation. In applying that framework to the Indonesian case, we start in the paper by trying to identify the key actors' interests and agendas as they've related to education policy and its implementation. And we identify four main groups, which we label for the sake of parsimony: predatory elites, religious elites, technocratic elements, and progressive elements. Predatory elites are basically figures from the military, the bureaucracy, the political parties, the major corporations who seek power, seek control over the state apparatus, essentially to pursue predatory or rent-seeking objectives. In relation to education policy in particular, they have had three main interests or agendas. The first has related to predation or rent seeking. They've seen the education system as a way of mobilizing resources and distributing patronage. They've had a paternalistic, what we call a paternalistic agenda, which is essentially about the exercise of political and social control. And finally, because these have been the dominant set of actors within Indonesia's political economy since independence. They've had a nation-building objective as well, and the education system has been a crucial mechanism through which they've sought to build both Indonesia as a nation and the Indonesian state as the state component in the nation state. The second set of actors that we identify we call religious elites. We identify them as a separate grouping to predatory elites, but they can be thought of, they're probably best thought of as a subset of predatory elites. They share the, broadly speaking, the same agenda as them. In talking about religious elites, we're thinking here in particular of the leading figures within Islamic political parties and the major Islamic social organisations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, which have historically been quite active in Indonesian politics. Their agenda, as we said, broadly corresponds to that of predatory elites, but at the same time, they have two specific concerns. I mean, the first has been to ensure a place for religiosity and spiritual learning in the Indonesian education system. The second has been to ensure funding equity for religious schools. Both Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama oversee extensive networks of schools and universities. They've been relatively poorly funded compared to public schools. And so one of their main agendas has been to gain greater financial security for their educational institutions. Technocratic elements are basically sort of market-oriented economists and the like, who seek to promote a sort of market-oriented reform agenda in relation to education policy, and I've listed some of the elements of that on the slide. Progressive elements basically NGO activists, activists associated with independent teacher trade unions, some education academics, particularly ones coming out of sort of critical traditions in education studies, who advocate a social justice or human rights sort of agenda. And we characterise their interest and agenda as relating to equality, social justice, anti-corruption, good governance, and they've been opposed to the sort of marketising reforms that technocrats have promoted. Oops, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a bit too far.
A little more than 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. All right, that's good. Look, a significant part of the paper traces the history of education policy and its implementation in Indonesia and the political dynamics that have shaped them. I'll just take you through briefly what we say in relation to the New Order period and the post-New Order period. In the New Order period, we characterise the political settlement as depicted on the slide. The larger the circle in these diagrams I'm about to show you, the greater the influence over education policy and its implementation. So the New Order we characterised as a period dominated by a political settlement in which predatory elements were the dominant group. And technocratic elements and religious elites exercise some influence, but marginal compared to predatory elites. Progressive elements, by contrast, were more or less completely marginalised, subject to a range of authoritarian controls and exclusionary practices that limited their access to the education policy making process. And the upshot of this situation was that education policy and its implementation really became a reflection of the dominant predatory interests. So the education system was, to use a term coined by Ross McLeod, an economist at the ANU, it became part of the education system, became part of the franchise structure of the new order, by which he refers to a practice whereby positions in the bureaucracy were sold to the highest bidder in exchange for the opportunity to use those positions to mobilise rents through corrupt practices. So, you know, positions as heads of school or heads of local education agencies were bought and sold. That was the sort of practice. At the same time, the education system became a crucial way in which the new order mobilised votes at election time. Positions in the education bureaucracy were distributed as patronage. The education system was used to promote the state ideology, a key mechanism of political and social control. Also the use of Indonesian language, a key element in the nation building agenda. In the post-New Order period, the characteristics of the political settlement changed. Predatory elites have remained the dominant group, but have been, I guess, less dominant than they were during the New Order period. Technocratic elites have exercised more influence than was the case during the New Order period, particularly in the early stages of the post-New Order period, when the country was dealing with the effects of the Asian financial crisis and was subject to an IMF rescue package and the like. Religious elites have remained influential to a degree, become a bit more independent of predatory elites. Progressive elements have remained relatively marginal, but have been able to access new policy spaces made available by virtue of the process of democratization. So their influence over policy has improved. The upshot in terms of policy and its implementation has been a situation where the focus has been on a set of marketising reforms in education policy, and then pushed back against those reforms, largely from predatory interests operating in concert with progressive, or in effective alliance with progressive elements. I will skip ahead.
About 1 minute to wrap it up.
That is just right. I will skip ahead now to the conclusions. So look, basically we conclude with two main points. The first is that sustained improvements in learning will only occur if there's a fundamental reconfiguration of the political settlement that has characterised a country's political economy. In the absence of such a shift, moves to increase funding levels, address human resource deficits, eliminate perverse incentive structures, and improve education management in accordance with technocratic templates of international best practice or progressive notions of equity and social justice, the sorts of measures that have been the focus of education reform efforts in Indonesia so far, are unlikely to produce the intended results. However, this does not mean there's no hope for the future. The emergence of more inclusive policy-making spaces as a result of democratisation have created room for technocratic and progressive elements to exercise continued influence over education policy and its implementation. At the same time, intensifying structural imperatives for Indonesia to improve its education system have emerged as the knowledge and technology sectors have become an increasingly important source of global economic growth. In this context, there may be some value in proponents of improved learning outcomes in Indonesia engaging more substantially with actors in the business community around issues to do with learning, particularly in so-called creative industries such as IT, software development, media and film, that are at the forefront of the emergence of a knowledge or technology-based economy in Indonesia. We're skeptical, by contrast, in the value of seeking to promote improved learning through engagement with parents and school children, given their weakness as a political actor. So that's it from me. Back to you, Marla.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for hard-hitting, but you didn't leave us on a totally pessimistic note, so we appreciate it. We'll turn over to Jonathan to talk about his work in Vietnam.
Hopefully I'm unmuted. And am I?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. It's great to be with you virtually from the Netherlands here, and I'm going to attempt a world speed record to get through a substantial amount of material, but hopefully communicate a clear and interesting story about what's happened in Vietnam, which is, of course, is an education and learning outlier. And what essentially I am up to in this presentation is to ask, how is Vietnam's education system performing? Why is it performing particularly well? What features of Vietnam and its education system, and specifically accountability relations within its education system, can help to explain its impressive learning outcomes internationally? And then the significance. So what can Vietnam, if it's so special, possibly tell the world, particularly with respect to the value of a systems-based approach? And so essentially the argument I'm going to make is that Vietnam, over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, or potentially much longer, has developed a combination of what I'll refer to as multiple countervailing accountabilities. Basically, the idea is that if large-scale education system tends toward bureaucratic rigidity and mediocrity, that features of Vietnam, in particular, high levels of sustained political commitment, are reflected in robust public spending, significant redistribution across provinces, and consistent attention to the education system by the Communist Party of Vietnam, in combination with the promotion of professionalism within the bureaucracy and schools, perpetual political processes that are constantly functioning through the Communist Party of Vietnam, and finally, high levels of societal involvement in education, seen on the one hand through what I'll call societal investment, and on the other hand, societal engagement. And so in beginning to think about Vietnam's experience, I'm just clicking here to try to advance the slide, but it's at the moment not responsive. We can begin with this how question. So firstly, Vietnam's performance around learning suggests, the possibilities of achieving great learning outcomes at low levels of income. And most people are familiar with the fact that Vietnam has done really well, but there's room for improvement. And furthermore, there are aspects of the education system and the way it operates that are brutal, in the sense that people with less money have much less access. So there are these inequalities and inequities around education. Furthermore, there are these weaknesses in upper secondary and post-secondary education. Vietnam does well, that is, but it can do better still. And so what we have done in our RISE country research team is performed a sort of diagnostic of the entire system. You're familiar with Vietnam's status as an outlier with respect to learning, but also that, here we see the lower bottom income quintile in the green, dropping out of the education system at a much sharper rate than other groups, speaking to some of the inequalities that we observe. So why? How do we explain Vietnam's performance? Does it have to do with its more than 1,000 years of social history influenced by Confucianism, which is undeniably a rich aspect of the country's culture and education system and traditions? Is it the presence of a communist party here, specifically the Communist Party of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh on the lower left and Marx and Lenin overseeing the event of the party Congress and the General Secretary there on the top? Or is it something having to do with economic growth? Vietnam has gone from a low-income country to a lower middle-income country with an extremely rapidly growing economy. And of course, the presence of vast amounts of resources has been very helpful in a lot of ways. So what we've sought to do in this research, which of course I've done with Big Dung Hang, who's a researcher, postdoc at the University of Minnesota, is extend the systems thinking framework from the RISE program to the Vietnam context, and to try to see how aspects of this framework that have been highlighted in a sense, register or can be observed in the Vietnam context. How are these, in other words, sort of embedded in the context of Vietnam? Can you back up the slide, please? Whoever the Wizard of Oz is governing the slide. Thank you. So, why are learning outcomes strong and weak in various parts of the country? Why do conditions accounting for performance exist, and what explains systems coherence or incoherence with respect to learning? And so, what we've done, of course, us in the RISE program, we're familiar with these important aspects of education systems. And in particular, we're interested in politics, political commitments, and public governance. And both the paper that Andrew Rosser and I have written are under Alec Gershberg's PET A, that is Political Economy of Adoption of Education Policies. And we've applied the framework developed within that initiative to explore accountability relations in the education system, especially to try to understand what features of the education system lend to a certain coherence for learning. And so, back up, please, one slide, thank you. What I'm positioning myself as doing is contributing to this emerging literature on the politics of education. And indeed, I'm hoping in the not too distant future to turn this research into a book that can stand as a contribution of one case study within this broader literature. Sorry. And so what we try to do is go down to the grassroots, but also look at the national level and ask which features of politics, accountability relations, and institutions have shaped the goals, evolution, and performance of Vietnam's education system over the last 4 decades. And this is a period, of course, that corresponded with Vietnam's transition to a more market-oriented society geared toward commodity production for the world market. And so I'll just go through some of the sort of findings, but before I do that, I will just briefly touch upon, as I click away here at the, could you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you, to the research methods. And what we're doing is adopting an historical sociological approach, an extended case approach in which we're extending theoretical ideas and concepts to the context of Vietnam. We've undertaken deep explorations of the embeddedness of education systems and learning as we observe them in the Vietnam context. We've developed a process tracing evolution of Vietnam's education system, entailing an extensive review of documents spanning 4 decades and even beyond. And with respect to data collection and analysis, these have been guided by concepts and frameworks taken from RISE, Saber, as well as the work of Brian Levy, Sam Hickey, and Hossein as well. And our data included data from 76 in-depth interviews at the central and local levels undertaken over the course of the last several years, focus groups, as well as participant observation, and a research focus on the national level, as well as experiences in 3 Vietnam provinces, as well as several districts, commons, and schools within them. And so let's just talk a little bit about some of our findings. And essentially, there are 3 basic conjectures that we advance across these 3 themes: political commitments of the Communist Party of Vietnam regarding education learning, features of accountability relations, and societal participation in the education system. And those include societal investment and societal engagement. So firstly, and I'm sorry that with respect to party politics, the Communist Party of Vietnam is Vietnam's dominant organization. It pervades every aspect of social life and is dominant across all social fields. In the context of Vietnam, we have been very interested in observing the political commitment, longstanding political commitment of the Communist Party to education. And, the education policy, of course, plays a multifunctional role in every country, including societal socialization, the promotion of dominant political viewpoints, as well as education and learning. And in the Vietnam context, we have conjectured that party politics, in a way, enhances the coherence of the education system with respect to learning through its perpetual political process within all levels of the bureaucracy. It runs parallel with policy implementation and service delivery, and it affects relations within the education system. And this, we contend or conjecture, lends force to accountability relations within and across organizations. And you can think, for example, of countries like Indonesia or India that lacks this sort of permanent political process going on throughout the bureaucracy as a point of cross-national exploration. And what we observe is political priorities within the education system are addressed regularly by the party and party cells, and that these really have a substantial influence on political and career incentives for principals and teachers, and is just very present and palpable within the country and its education system. Now,
Jonathan, you've got just 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to accelerate a little bit because I still have a fair amount to go. One of the things I want to point out here is that in Vietnam, the particular features of the country's transition to a more market-based society are important. Specifically, they entailed an acute fiscal crisis of the state in the late 1980s and 1990s, which meant that a substantial burden of the financial costs of education were shifted onto households. And on the one hand, Vietnam has gradually seen this rapid economic growth, which permitted the state to make significant and increasingly large-scale investments. Vietnam's public expenditure as a share of GDP in Southeast Asia is quite high comparatively, even though nobody in Vietnam exactly knows where it goes. But there are resources sloshing around in the system, and this undeniably has permitted an expansion in provision of education, access to education. On the other hand, we've also seen schools facing a limited budget envelope resort to all sorts of formal and informal payments. And in this instance, a bit of a scandal here in the city of Haiphong, which is one of the cities we explored, in which parents were asked to pony up $400 for the 2017 year for all of these various bells and whistles that they were expected to pay. And so this is the sort of societal investment that we're really quite interested in. And specifically, we conjecture that in the Vietnam context, this existence of this payment to formal and informal payments, as well as shadow education, extra study, that, at best, you get what you pay for, which is better than contexts where people are shelling out money and they don't get anything for it. At worst, it's costly and unfair. But what we argue is that a weakness or limitation of the system, namely its financial inability to provide, a great education for everyone, is perhaps under certain conditions a lever of accountability in the sense that folks are expecting and frequently get increased attentiveness from teachers. But of course, this is a pay-to-play kind of arrangement and should not be romanticized. That is also a key mechanism or driver of inequality. So just sort of moving forward here in the presentation, and the formatting is this last theme of societal engagement. Vietnam is, in my view, I have some notion of what's happening in other countries, extraordinarily engaged in education, or even outside the Bill Gates schools, which, I don't know, the Gates Foundation agreed to name a school in Vietnam, but these parents are opposing teachers in this school forcing the kids to do after hours education. People are engaged. The state is engaged. The corruption scandals resulting in 21 years in prison in the education sector. It's a really major focus of everyday life in Vietnam. And we conjecture that broad civic engagement brings an additional element of accountability, that there's a vibrant public sphere in education, that state media, which is large and state controlled, but nonetheless does provide a platform for significant amounts of discussion at various levels, that is a quite salient feature. And indeed, that public calls for transparency bring pressure to bear on the education system. And these claims that we're making need to be substantiated, of course, but we are longstanding students of the education system. And while I won't say trust us, it's real, I will say that these are the features of education and Vietnam's education system that are salient. And, teachers, of course, as is frequently the case, are caught in the middle. I'm not going to have time to discuss this point in any detail at the moment. But again, we
Andrew,
have these.
Jonathan, just 1 minute.
Okay. We have these multiple countervailing accountabilities that we are suggesting exist, emanating from political leadership from the Communist Party of Vietnam, contributions from society to enhance accountability, and civic engagement, which encourages a culture of accountability. And I'm just going to briefly go through a couple of images to, a couple of points. This helps to account for the sources and limits of Vietnam's performance on learning, prospective contributions to enhancing policy effectiveness. We are exploring subnational diversity in policies and practices, in particular through education finance and also education management information systems. To give you a very brief example, 15 years ago, no one knew what was going on. Only about 10 provinces had regular interaction between their finance and education departments. Now the central government has 31 million unique individual records and can pull up multiple data points on any student at any time. Could you please switch to the final slide before the last to the final slide, if that's possible?
Jonathan.
One more. So one more slide. Yep. And so, hopefully what this sort of research can contribute is an example, hopefully a successful one, of a mode of research that distills what are really complex features of education systems that we're all grappling with in the RISE program, and extend those to the exploration of accountabilities in different contexts. And what I hope the research eventually will show, it's still in progress, is that we can, leverage our deep understandings of specific contexts in a way that shows how education systems and all of these aspects, including elements of the 5.4, grid and all of these things table, that all of these aspects can be deeply understood in different contexts in a way that can advance the field, even when the RISE program winds down, which is shortly to be the case. So I will leave it there. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. You're getting applause here in DC. We'll turn it over now to Svetlana.
Hi, everybody. I am kicking myself for not being there in person. My son just went back to in-person school, and it's been complicated, to say the least. But it's great joy to be here, one of my favorite conferences. So I'm going to be talking about decentralization in education and trust in Nepal. And I repeat, not a political scientist, so please forgive mistakes. And I look forward to learning more in the discussion section. Okay, now the proceed arrow has disappeared. I don't know why. Okay, let me try. Oh, there it is. Okay. So basically, I think most of us will agree that decentralization is kind of the most profound and meaningful reform that an education system can potentially go through. But it is also impossibly hard to study, right? And the reason is because if you come in too early, right, then things are moving so fast and everything is reshaping so quickly that it's very hard to get a foothold to really see where things are going, right? But if you come in too late, then in a sense, you've missed that window to really learn what happened, right? The dust of decentralization settles, and then it's very hard to make out what caused what. So in this work, what we are trying to put forward is this idea that trust can be a nice proxy with which to study early stage decentralization, right? And this is for two big reasons. One reason is that trust can be a nice litmus test for what the perceived legitimacy of the newly forming political structures is like. how do people really feel? Are they legitimate, not? And the second thing is it can be kind of a nice predictor in some ways of the expected smoothness of transition, right? So if there's very low trust, you would expect the transition to be rocky and complicated. So we apply this lens to Nepal. So to tell you a little bit about Nepal, in Nepal, there's been this long-term civil conflict from 1996 to 2006, the Maoist insurgency, which was essentially predicated on this idea that the center needed to devolve more power, right? That the politics had completely been captured by the elites and nobody was hearing the people in remote areas, even people outside Kathmandu, right, were not really being heard. And there was like a lot of strife that the disadvantaged communities were not being represented. So the idea was that Nepal had to devolve power. And so finally, this was a promise made to end the insurgency in 2006. And finally, in 2017, this big bang decentralization happened through a constitutional amendment. And the reason I call it Big Bang is that in December 2017, 753 local governments were formed, right, were elected and formed. And then all the responsibilities for a number of things, including education service delivery for school education, was transferred to these local governments pretty much overnight. And the idea was that, yes, now local governments will be responsible for this. And over the course of 2018, specific functions and specific nuts and bolts of this arrangement will be figured out. And this is precisely the moment in which we start our empirical work. So we essentially did a combination of surveys and survey experiments across three layers: teachers, head teachers, and local leaders. And we tried to underpin a lot of this work with focus group discussions. Okay, so the paper talks about lots of different tales about what's happening on trust between this layer and so on and so forth. But in the interest of time, I'm going to basically talk about what to me stands out as the compelling story, right? The big compelling story of this paper. I hope you find it compelling too. And this story has 3 acts, okay? So the first act is that schools love decentralization. They are thrilled. They are hugely optimistic. More than 80%, in some cases 85% of head teachers and teachers are very optimistic about decentralization. And this optimism originates from 3 big factors, right? So the first is what I alluded to, what I foreshadowed earlier, which is this idea of voice, right? So one of my favorite quotes that came out of the focus group discussions was head teacher saying, having competent authorities close is much more useful than having very highly qualified ones far away, right? So they are really looking for people who are close to them and who will hear them. And continuing this idea of voice is that they feel that local governments will be more accountable to them, to the schools, than the center was, okay? The second factor behind the optimism is the idea of trust, right? Now, trust can be notoriously hard to elicit. So what we did was we did the survey experiment, and bear with me as I describe the survey experiment. So what we did was we randomly divided the head teachers and teachers into 2 groups. And we described to them the same situation, which was slightly ambiguous. So the situation was that, in this village, the out of school students have dropped by 5% and the scholarship expenditures have gone up by 18%. But we have not audited these expenditures. There's been no evaluation. And how likely are you to believe that the people in charge have positive intentions? So, and then there are multiple questions to get at that, right? And in one random group, the person in charge is a center appointed person, a district education officer. And in the other group, the person in charge is a local leader, okay? And so the situation is exactly the same. There's the exact ambiguity in, what happened. And we find that head teachers and teachers are significantly more likely to ascribe positive intentions to the local leaders than they are to the district education officers. So they're giving them more benefit of the doubt. Now, there isn't too much faith on either actor, just to be clear, but in relative terms, there's significantly more faith in the local governments than in the center. And then finally, the other element is autonomy, right? So there is this idea that the center doesn't really have the degrees of freedom to act. And whereas, local governments will have more degrees of freedom to act in the interest of the school, right? And you see this most clearly in the most bothersome aspect of school management, which is dealing with poor performing teachers, right? So in the minds of head teachers and teachers, they feel that central government, more head teachers and teachers feel that central government is afraid to sanction poor performing teachers than they think the local leaders are likely to be. Okay, so these are the factors that are driving the optimism around decentralization. And this brings us to the second act of the story, which is this optimism justified? Now, in many ways, it could be justified, but the one area in which it is not fully justified is precisely the area of managing poor performing teachers. Okay, so when we talk to the local leaders, we find that only 1 in 3 are actually willing to sanction underperforming teachers, right? The rest of them are comfortable punting it off to the school. And we also looked at this via another survey experiment, where again, we randomly divided the local leaders into 2 groups. And for both the groups, we described the same situation of teacher underperformance, right? And we said, oh, this teacher is absent, this teacher X is absent more than 50% of the time. Do you think the person in charge should take disciplinary action against the teacher, right? And in one random group, the person in charge is a center appointed district education officer. And in the other group, it's the local leader, right? So we are not saying, will you take action? We are saying, should a local leader take action, right? And here again, with the same situation, local leaders are significantly more likely to support taking action against poor performing teacher if the person taking the action is the center, but not if the person taking the action is the local leader, right? So they are not
that just 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so then that brings us to the final act of the story, which is that, okay, so the local leaders don't want to take responsibility of poor performing teachers, but what do they feel about taking responsibility for teachers on the whole? And here, I think to nobody's surprise, local leaders do want to be responsible for teachers. So in terms of whether centers should be responsible for hiring teachers, both local leaders and head teachers, for most part, believe that centers should be hiring teachers, but the degree of consensus is lower among local leaders. And it is actually very low among the elected local leaders, right? So we have 2 types of local leaders, some of whom are elected, but then within those, there are those who have been appointed by the elected local leaders. So the bureaucrats feel that, yes, it's the center who should be responsible for hiring teachers, but the elected local leaders mostly believe that the local leaders should be responsible for hiring teachers. You see a similar divide in terms of who should be responsible for teacher promotion. Most local leaders want to be responsible. And then finally, local leaders are surprisingly open to sharing implementation responsibilities with the center on a number of tasks. I'm sorry, this is too, very, very small font. But the one area in which they are most fierce about their independence is the area of teacher monitoring. So teacher monitoring is the one area where they're least supportive of sharing implementation responsibility with the center. Okay, so basically, this finding is echoed also in the focus group discussion. So despite all the optimism that schools have about decentralization, they are very worried about the politicization of education via teachers under the decentralized regime. And so I leave you with this big, I don't think it's a big message. I was trying to come up with a really like hard-hitting parting shot, but the best I can come up with is that basically the problem with education management, which is everybody wants to control teachers, but nobody wants to be responsible for sanctioning teachers, continues in some sense in the decentralized education system as well, from the early indicators of trust. So let me stop there. Thank you so much.
For those great presentations. The question tab is opened, so please submit questions, and I've got them here, and I'll be going back and forth between the hubs and online. I wanted to start, Noreen, since you're here and you had a question, did you want to start out and ask your question? Yeah, go, ask it. And just to give a heads up, we're going to go next to our hub in Abuja and then to Oxford after that. So we'll do in person first, and then I'll go to the online questions. It's on. You're good.
Thank you. So those abroad can hear me?
Yes, they can hear you.
Okay, great. So this is a question for Andrew. So you mentioned sort of in the first period that there's this idea of predatory elites, and yes, this has all kinds of implications that you talked about, like capturing rents, this other part of like nation building ideas. I'm wondering what you think about how this interacts with this huge education expansion program that happened in the 70s, the InPress program that built, thousands of schools. A lot of work has shown that this program really increased access to education, wages of the kids later on, and this actually translated into positive effects in the next generation as well. So there was something, right, that in the government and within elites and different, maybe even technocrats, I'm not sure, but there was something in there that led to this investment that had positive outcomes. So I just wondered how you think that relates to some of the maybe more problematic factors that you described.
Marla, do you want me to answer that question?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. All right. Look, thanks for the question. It's a really good one. Look, I think in part the answer here lies in the notion of developmental legitimacy. The new order was, although it was an authoritarian government, it still sought legitimacy for its rule in a variety of different ways. And one of the ways in which it did that was to invest in the social sectors. I guess, the reason I've kind of constructed the analysis in the way that I have has been, I think you're right to say, look, the new order, notwithstanding the fact it was dominated by predatory elites, still had a sort of developmentalist agenda that allowed for the possibility of improvements in living standards and educational outcomes and so on. But I guess the thing I've been sort of grappling with is the fact that the evidence suggests that Indonesia's education system is not fundamentally about learning. There's just not, despite the ostensible purpose of schools and universities and so on, in Indonesia, there's little evidence to suggest that they are effective in promoting positive learning outcomes. If the education system in Indonesia is not fundamentally about learning, what is it about? And why is it that since the constitution was revised in the early post-New Order period, the government has been spending 20% of its budget on education? What other functions, what other purposes does the education system fulfill? And that's really what I've been trying to sort of tease out, I guess, the other sorts of agendas, the other sorts of interests that have been at work in shaping education. And it seems to me that, whilst the new order may well have had, some sort of, or may well have been seeking some sort of developmental legitimacy and may well have been open to the possibility of positive educational outcomes, it was also motivated in no small part by the other sorts of agendas that I've mentioned. I mean, building an education system was a way of building the nation state, promoting the nation building project, extending the franchise, the new order franchise beyond the sort of central government level out into the regions and so on.
Noreen has a quick follow-up comment.
Question. That all makes a lot of sense, and thank you, because I probably wouldn't have thought of that. Just a follow-up. So if there wasn't improved learning, why did wages increase, and why did people like shift out of agriculture and more into sort of industry and services? So what other factors happen there? I'm actually writing a paper on this, so I'd be really interested to know.
Actually let you and Andrew connect offline, because that's a great question, but I do want to move to, and it sounds like a longer discussion that you two can have. I want to move to the Abuja hub and see if there's a question from our colleagues there.
Thank you.
Yet?
I have
go ahead.
I have two important questions. The first is to the last speaker. That is very interesting presentation. But my question is, I was personally interested in the responses of the local leaders. So, in Nigerian situation, you will see that local leaders might be interested in the decentralization and taking over the control, because it becomes a means of compensation or a kind of payoff to their to political sufferers and investors. They can appoint teachers, recommend teachers who can be recruited. So in your situation, did you check if the reasons or whatever might have inspired their responses? So I'm interested in underlying factor that influence the responses of the local leaders in being interested in the decentralization. Then my second question is to the political economy. I wanted to understand the different political issues like election, changes in government, census, such key issues. Did they make any particular impact or contributing to influencing the crisis or reducing it at different points? And what is it like over the time? Thank you.
Alana, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Sorry, did you mean me, Marla, or Andrew?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. So no, thank you. That's a great question. And, you're completely right that, there is this feeling, even among head teachers and teachers, that, local leaders may use this position for political ends, right? Of course, talking to local leaders, it's very hard to elicit true motivations, right? They're not gonna tell it. But I will say there are two things. One is that the head teachers and teachers are so fed up with the center and basically the inaction of the center and the apathy of the center that even though they know that local leaders may politicize their function, they're willing to try something new rather than continue with what's going on. And the second thing is your instinct is absolutely right that head teachers and teachers do believe that the two areas that the local leaders will use for political ends are teachers. That's why the head teachers want teacher hiring and teacher promotion to remain with the center. And the second area is scholarships and supporting marginalized children. So there's a lot of fear that these areas will become very politicized, and actually head teachers and teachers want these to remain with the center.
Great, thank you. Andrew, do you want to come in quickly?
Yes, look, a quick answer to the question about the role of elections. Look, some time ago, Merrily Grindle writing about Latin America, argued that access-enhancing reforms in education were a whole lot easier politically than reforms aimed at trying to improve quality. And the reason for that is that access-enhancing reforms create new stakeholders. So you create a constituency that benefits from the reform and may well support the reform as a result, whereas quality-enhancing reforms often involve taking on entrenched stakeholders, vested interests within an education system. And I think that's been the dynamic at work in relation to the connection between elections and education policy in Indonesia. So the post-New Order period, a more democratic period in the country's history, has seen initiatives to enhance the availability of free basic education in Indonesia. This has been a policy that political elites at both the local level and national level have championed. By contrast, efforts in relation to the learning crisis have not really been something that political figures have championed during election campaigns.
Great, thank you, Andrew. We're going to head to the Oxford Hub, and especially someone in Oxford who has a question for Jonathan should be given priority, but we'll take one question from BSG. And if there are no questions from Oxford, which it sounds like they're not, I'll go to some of the questions from online. Oxford, pipe up if somebody has a question over there. So the first one is for Jonathan, and this comes from Awamina Joshi, who asks, the largest ethnic group in Vietnam, the Kin, account for nearly 85% of the population, while most other minorities account for about 1% each. Would you say that Vietnam's nearly homogenous population, resulting in similar sociocultural values, also contributes significantly to the demand for accountability from government? My intuition being that politics in the country no longer focuses on regionalism and ethnicity, and the need to further political agendas through the education system, like nation building, that those are no longer salient.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and relatively speaking, Vietnam's ethnic minority population has been, a bit of a loser over the last 20 years of exceptional gains in income and living standards. They're overrepresented among the poor, and education results have been much less encouraging. So this is one of the examples of features of Vietnam's education that haven't worked particularly well. One of the things that's occurred is a lot of migration, people being pushed off of land, even across regions, into settings where multiple ethnic groups have been essentially faced with the difficult task of learning a new language. And so, I think that your intuition, is, ethnicity is perhaps not particularly salient, except for ethnic minorities. They continue to be marginalized. And so I think over the next decade or two, Vietnam has quite a lot of work to do, not Vietnam, but of course, education sector stakeholders from all sides, and enhancing the accountability of these populations that, as you say, represent a significant share of the population, 15%, but which have remained largely marginalized, including in the education system, as is reflected in their much less encouraging learning outcomes.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I'm told there is a question in Oxford, so I think it's Miguel you had two, I think, but if you could choose one of them.
I'd just like to ask a question to Svetlana about decentralization. So my question pertains to inequalities between local government units. So obviously local government units have varying levels of resource availability, fragility as well. So I wonder if these between group differences account for interest levels as well. And secondly, from a policy, how do we ensure that if we decentralize, we're not just merely reproducing inequalities between local government units?
Thanks so much. No, that's a great point. We couldn't go into it as deeply as we wanted because it was just stretching our sample sizes, and with cross just using these, there's just so many confounding factors that you're always a little bit nervous. But I think the one factor that did come out very strongly is that we asked about the desire to get capacity building from the center and the desire to have joint implementation with center. And here the weaker local governments, which are coming from more poverty, were more willing to have a more top-down capacity building, right? And more willing to share implementation responsibilities with the center than the more advanced ones.
Great, thank you. We'll go to some more online questions. This one is for Andrew, and it's from Luis Crouch. And Luis is asking that it's not clear to him whether the progressive elements just don't care very much about learning levels, or if they value learning, but they're simply unable to work with the technocratic elements because of differences in a view of what it means to achieve that. And if rapprochement is possible, are there any practical pointers that can be given to both international actors like us and local actors within those elements about how to push along that rapprochement? And he notes that he's particularly interested in the actors in the technocratic elements that are highly dependent on skilled labor, IT, media, et cetera.
Okay, look, thanks for that question, Lewis. Look, it seems to me that a lot of the difficulty here between, what we've labelled progressive elements and the technocratic elements is ideological in nature. On the one side, on the technocratic side, you've got a group of people who support markets. On the other side, you've got a group of people who are committed to sort of state-led development of one kind or another. I mean, in particular, in a way that's sort of consistent with social democratic, if not in some cases, sort of socialist sort of principles. So it's very, very hard to bridge that sort of divide. I think where there is some common ground, though, and I think where there is some common ground is actually around the effectiveness of the education system in promoting learning outcomes. So I think there is scope there to bring these two elements together. But it'll be a challenge certainly a challenge in doing so. I mean, I guess what I've been sort of thinking, though, is that neither of those elements, I mean, even if they can bridge the divide, the ideological divide between them, are likely to have the power to drive the sort of systemic change that is necessary to reorient Indonesia's education system away from its current lack of concern with learning outcomes to a situation where promoting positive learning outcomes is much more central to the mission and the purpose of the education system. It seems to me that those two groups need to get together, not only with one another, but also potentially with sections of the business community. One of the things about a political settlements analysis is that it changes the time horizon for analysis from what can be done in 3 to 5 years in the context of a donor-funded project to some sort of longer time horizon. And I guess what I was thinking about in the final parts of the paper, where I try to be a little bit more optimistic about what can be achieved, is about steps that can be taken to sort of build coalitions that at some point in the future may be substantial enough that they can promote that sort of systemic change. And so that was the context in which I sort of singled out particular elements of the business community that I thought might be most amenable to a sort of learning focused agenda in relation to education.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. The next question was put by Keith Lewin to he put it to Andrew, but it's actually a question that maybe everyone could chime in on. So maybe we'll start with Jonathan and go Jonathan, Svetlana, Andrew on this one. But Keith was saying this is a very interesting analysis, and he was wondering what implications flow from your insights for evidence-based policy that's driven by trying to identify what works nationally and in terms of international best practices.
Well, I think one of the major tasks facing Vietnam is to make sense of what actually is happening in various parts of the country. Vietnam has had a lot going for it, including, various aspects of its history that have placed a real emphasis on education and learning, and of course, all this economic growth. But there was this politically driven process of decentralization, which, donors helped out with, and a lot of good things happened. But one of the bad things that happened is that no one knew what was going on. And so, recently, there have been efforts to improve, for example, information systems, and also get a handle on what's happening with respect to allocation of resources for education across provinces. And so with respect to, evidence-based research, one of the things that we're exploring in our project is how practices in the fields of finance and information may map onto some of the diversity that we that we observe with respect to learning outcomes, both across provinces and within provinces. But the RISE program has been going on several years, but in some respects, I feel like we're just getting going, and that we're developing a sort of agenda of research that in which more substantial use of evidence and feedback into policy will become possible. So it's a great and important question, and the short answer is I'll get back to you, but there's a lot going on. Yeah.
Sorry, Marla, can you just repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
I can, although my colleague has removed it. Oh no, here we go. Okay. Interesting analysis. What implications flow from these insights for evidence-based policy driven by identifying what works nationally and in terms of international best practice?
So I think for my analysis, and this maybe didn't come out very clearly in the presentation, but there are basically three big things that come out. One is that, people want to be heard. So bringing some decision-making closer is definitely a great idea. But at the same time, there is all this fear about politicization. So what people have a lot of faith in Nepal is open data and community meetings, right? So they have no faith in central audits and stuff like that. So they believe that the decision-making should be closer to them. But there should be a lot of transparency and open data and community meetings to really help make the system transparent. And the other big thing was that local governments are surprisingly open to working with the center, right? So there was no lack of trust. I mean, a little bit, but the local governments trust the center a lot, and they're looking to them for capacity building and are looking to them for some joint implementation. So I think if this momentum can be seized, I mean, I'm talking about Nepal, but even in other places, I think there's a lot of scope to not make this a zero-sum game between the center and local governments. Thanks.
Andrew, to you. You're not off the hook.
Okay. Look, I think the answer to the question here is, essentially that the challenge of reforming education systems is not simply a matter of following templates of international best practice. It's not a matter of adjusting a policy here or putting in place a new institution there. The challenge is more fundamental than that. I mean, by tweaking a policy, by putting in place, by changing institutions, you may be able to achieve some degree of positive change in terms of learning outcomes. So I don't want to be just sort of dismissive of efforts in that respect. But if you're going to reorient an education system, the challenge is fundamentally a political one, and it's about the characteristics of the political settlement that really shape the broad orientation of the education system and what it's about at the end of the day, whether it's about learning or about other sorts of achieving other sorts of objectives.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, and thanks to the panel. We've just got like a minute left, so I'm gonna wrap it up. And so to actually build on that last point that Andrew raised and say that I'm feeling very encouraged after this panel by the analysis that's been done in these three papers, because a lot of times in our discussion, discussions that we have around RISE, we try to talk about what works, what can we do differently, and the barrier that always comes up is the politics. Politics is the barrier, and we don't know what to do about it, and it's this big complicated thing, and we can't understand it, we can't get our heads around it. And what these 3 papers showed me when I was looking at them preparing is like, no, we really can actually learn something. We can understand, we can do deep analysis and understand the interests and the power dynamics in a country and why they've led to the outcomes that we see across the education system. So I'm encouraged and excited by this work. I hope that you all are feeling excited and motivated by the first day of the RISE conference and looking ahead to the next 2 days. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Oxford, to Claire, to wrap us up for the day. And thank you very much, Svetlana, Andrew, Jonathan, for excellent papers and discussion.
Thanks, Marla. You were great too.
Actually, whilst we're clapping, I think we should, there hasn't, compared to normal conferences, been quite as much clapping as we would usually have. So I think we should say thank you to all of our chairs, all of our speakers, everybody who's been virtually present or in one of the hubs, and have a big round of applause for everyone. So please join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. BST, 8 a.m. Eastern time. I can't do the calculation for everywhere else in the world that people are, but join us again tomorrow for 3 more really lively sessions, and I wish you a good evening. Do take a chance, if you have a chance, do take a look at the Encyclopedia that's just gone live. See you all tomorrow.